Hello everyone, and welcome to our bonus discussion Wednesday on the data science languages. So moving straight in, today I thought I'd talk about Windows Subsystem for Linux, and you may be asking why talk about that. So we'll get to that, but the basic idea is a lot of data science things are more of a Linux sort of thing. A lot of research has went into that domain. A lot of the concepts that you see relate to that. And because of that, sometimes there's a benefit to be able to run Linux. Your alternatives to running Linux are challenging sometimes because your alternative to WSL is something like a virtual machine or remote desktoping onto a different machine or physically having a separate Linux machine. Some of those are kind of challenging, so we'll talk a bit about what WSL is and why you might use it. We'll talk about how you configure it, how you turn it on, how you install Linux in it, and then using it and kind of what's the point, right? So going in, what is it? I've kind of outlined it a little bit, but it's basically a form of virtualization that it abstracts out what you have to do to use it. So if you've ever worked with something like VirtualBox or Hyper-V, there can be some interesting quirks with them. In particular, things like connecting to resources, network drives, whatever they might be. It can be kind of challenging at times. What the WSL does for you is makes it a whole lot simpler to do those things. You can basically, through the App Store, so the Microsoft Store, go and pick the flavor of Linux you want to run. So if you want to run Ubuntu 20, you can do that. And then it allows you to basically run Linux binaries inside of your Windows computer without having a separate Linux box or virtual machine, although there is one under the covers. You just don't have to worry about it as much. It's also pretty simple to use and set up. There's some advanced topics you can do with it, such as getting the GPU, so graphic processing unit, pass-through working. If you're doing some really interesting machine learning or data science work, so maybe you're doing some deep learning approaches and need the mathematical capabilities of a GPU to help you out, that comes in handy too, and you can certainly do it. So how do you get started with it? And it's pretty straightforward. There's a link on the screen there. You would start with that, microsoft.com/en-us Windows and then WSL/about. That tells you about what the Windows Subsystem for Linux is. There's several ways you can turn it on. You can do so at a command prompt. You can do it through PowerShell, or you can just go into the Windows features and turn it on, basically. So check the box and turn it on. You may have to reboot if you do it that way. But it's not the end of the world if you do. And once you've done that, then it's pretty much ready to go. If you were to do it inside of PowerShell, you use that command that you see on the screen, dsim/online enable feature. Feature name is Microsoft Windows Subsystem Linux, all, and then no restart to avoid having to restart the computer. You'll do want to make sure that the virtual machine is turned on. So on this previous side, there's a virtual machine platform. You'll want to make sure that that is checked. You'll also have to make certain that virtualization is turned on your BIOS on your computer. Your BIOS, sometimes it is by default, sometimes it isn't. Anymore, it typically is. You'll likely have to download the Linux kernel update package. All of this is outlined in that About page that I mentioned. And then typically speaking, you'll want to switch over to WSL2. There was a preliminary version of WSL came out maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even 6. Since then, they've come up with version 2, which is slightly better. The initial version just didn't do as much as what WSL2 does, and WSL2 is the active development path. So you want to pick the version before you install Linux, otherwise you have to deal with some sort of migration. It can be done, it's a little bit more work. So once you've got it turned on, your next step is to go into the store and search for, so first in Windows, go search for the store. So open up your start menu and type in store, and it'll come up, Microsoft Store. Once you've got it up and open, your next step is to go through and open the store up and search for WSL. That's the easiest way to look for it. You could also search for the particular flavor of Linux that you're looking for. But in this case, Ubuntu 20.04, one of the more common ones that you'll use. There's also 1804 is one that also has been used quite a bit. But you basically are going to pick a distribution. You probably also want to go ahead and install the Windows Terminal preview. Again, search inside of Microsoft Store for Windows Terminal Preview and install it. I'll show it to you here. Well, I can go ahead and show it to you right now. It's basically just a tabbed sort of environment that allows you to switch between multiple sort of things in a single way. You can do things here like open up a command prompt, so I can switch easily between a PowerShell window, a command prompt, and in this case WSL. And this is actually the Ubuntu 20.04.2.LTS running inside of the shell. So moving back to our presentation, you'll basically, as I just said, it supports various different sort of command line interfaces. Ubuntu itself and Linux in general for this space, although they've recently extended it, is typically text-based, so it is console-based, but there is active development going on of basically enabling Windows or UI-based interactions from Unix or Linux inside of Windows. There is some built-in integration, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, but you can do things like run your favorite code editor, or Visual Studio Code anyway, inside of Ubuntu. So you type in code and then the file, and it'll pop open inside of Windows, your base system, the file that you're trying to edit, enabling you to edit inside of your familiar environment in Windows without having to deal with maybe not such an elegant editor inside of the Linux environment, because sometimes they are lacking. Jumping back in I lost my slide. So once you've installed it, you basically want to open and basically pick a user. So whenever you do the process of doing store, and it'll be a little different because I already have it installed, but if you search then for Ubuntu or WSL, that's better because that's what I told you earlier. And you do this, I click on it, and it's going to know, hey, you've already got this installed, do you want to open it, right? And if you open it, it opens up onto essentially a terminal shell onto that process. Very similar to the Windows Terminal Preview that I'm showing you. The difference is it's a single window. It's like opening up a plain old command prompt inside of a DOS environment. Spinning, so I'll move on. Maybe it'll stop and we can come back to it. So once you've opened it, you'll basically go through and you open it up, and during the first run it's going to ask you for a username and a password. You have to pick one of them to do it. It is possible to kind of bypass that and have it launch as root, but it's not as good and it's not desirable for lots of reasons. So once you've done that, then you're into the realm where you can start doing things like installing Anaconda and such in that environment. To determine what version is available to you, you can type in cat proc inversion. So to see that, I'll go cat proc version, and it'll dump out the version of WSL that's running on this particular machine. And you can see here that it is WSL2. I'm actually running a pre-release of Windows so that I can do some GPU stuff. But generally speaking, you're going to want something that's WSL2. Another thing to understand is that you're running inside of a different environment. So this is, this isn't DOS, right? So if I type dir, it's smart enough to know I meant ls, right? And this is really a Linux environment. I can ask who am I, and it says that I'm Alan, and so on. And I can go to my directory and see that I have a working directory in home. This is how Linux works, is that it's a similar structure. So if you take a look at the root of that drive, this is a different drive. However, interestingly enough, you can access it from inside of Windows. So one of the nice things that is about this versus things like perhaps a VirtualBox sort of solution or whatever else, is oftentimes it's really challenging to be able to get a hold of the file system. Whenever you're having WSL installed and running, you actually then have this Linux folder that shows up, and here's Ubuntu 20.04, and this is the same file system that I see whenever I go in here and type ls/. So it's a way of traversing between the two in a seamless fashion. I can actually go to my home folder for Allen, so I open up home and then Allen, and if I wanted to do something crazy, one of the reasons you don't see these dot things is by default Linux, whenever you are doing an ls, it doesn't show you things that have a dot in them. So if you do ls-a, you'll see everything that matches those two things. If I do something like go in here and say new text file, and we'll say hello, and open that up, and I'm editing inside of Notepad inside of my base system. I can say hello world, and there should technically be a comma there, and we'll make it an excited hello world. Save that, and then if I go back over inside of my shell, there's now a hello there, and if I do cat hello, you can see that it prints out what I typed in that file. So it's the same file. I'm accessing it through my base system, but it's inside of a Linux environment. So that's where one of those nice things is that if you have data stored on your host machine, so I'm going to go here to mount and see in Allen, I've got a folder off of my C: of Allen that contains some things in it that I might want, and I can go into WSL and see the various files that I've installed or whatever over time. So you do have access to go both ways. You can go from Windows into the Linux file system underneath WSL, and you go from the WSL file system in Linux out to Windows. So you can go both directions and access things. And more importantly, this is the part that's kind of cool. I can say code, and then hello.txt is the file I created. And what that does, after the initial time of having to install a little service inside of Linux, is it opens up the file using my favorite or a editor, in this case Visual Studio Code, and you're able then to be able to go and make changes to it and save it back. Not exactly sure why it didn't show me the other, unless there's more than one hello. Oh, it's in a different folder because I switched folders, so I'm over into WSL, not inside of my home directory. So that's basically a way of traversing different file systems and invoking an editor from one location or another. That's what I just showed you, is this right here, which is basically I've got some files that I might want to edit, so some Python, and it's got the setup.py. I can open it up, and inside of Visual Studio Code it can do the color-coded syntax and so on, and it knows that it is a Python file. So there's I'm turning on the little pointer so I can point at it and show down here it says Python. That means that it knows that a .py is a Python file. It also has a little logo up here that is the Python logo, and it's actually doing color-coded syntax highlighting based upon that, so that comments have the pound sign, so that's why they're green, is their comments. So some pretty cool stuff, allowing you to have a familiar editor in a perhaps different environment. So another way is you may want to run Jupyter notebooks inside of a PowerShell or inside of a WSL environment. The reason to do that is that you might you want to use a library that isn't necessarily going to work in Windows, but is part of Jupyter, and they do kind of exist or inside of Python. Because sometimes you have Python libraries that are actually wrappers around Linux binaries that are running natively inside of a particular version of Linux, and you might be able to get them to work inside of Windows and using Jupyter inside of Windows, but you also may not. So that's kind of one of the scenarios where you might get it. One of the things I'll show you here is a second instance. I'm going to open up Ubuntu 18.04 and see if I've got Seeing if I got Jupyter installed, and I do. And it's a little different here because normally it will pop for you. Okay, in this case it did. And it popped into Mozilla. That's kind of interesting because I think that's actually a Linux version of Mozilla. So anyway, I've done some interesting things along the way. So this allows you to do things like figure out if maybe you're using PyTorch and you're wanting to know if GPUs are working. It's a way to do that sort of behavior inside of Jupyter, and it can be somewhat challenging to get some of those environments set up so that you have various libraries installed and so on. That is one use where, and this is an example of what I mentioned earlier about GPU pass-through. So the way this actually works is that Windows Subsystem for Linux is essentially a virtual machine running inside of Windows. My computer has a decent GPU card in it. So what GPU pass-through does is allow a process running inside of the Linux environment to access the GPU as though it were local, and so that allows you to do things like do PyTorch inside of a Linux framework, which is PyTorch is a deep learning framework, to do some computational stuff, right? So here's an example of basically showing TensorFlow running inside of a WSL, and it's the equivalent of 1 plus 3 and 2 plus 4, and it's not terribly riveting, and obviously outside of the scope of what we talk about in this course, but it is kind of interesting. So here's some links that would be relevant if you want to take a look at this. Certainly don't have to. You may want to revisit this in future courses, though, because one of the other courses that you're likely to take is a big data tools or big data technology course. One of the things you do in that is use Hadoop. It is possible and actually not all that hard to get Hadoop working inside of WSL. So something to file away for future references, maybe as an alternative to some of the other things, use WSL as the environment. A couple more things you can check to see if CUDA is installed correctly. There are ways that you can do, and this is more just in case you're curious, you can run multiple versions of the same distribution by doing an export and an import. Otherwise, it's kind of challenging to basically run two instances of Ubuntu 18 at the same time. But it is with this approach where you basically export it to a tar file, take that tar file, import it back in, giving it a different name. You then have two different instances of Ubuntu 18 running. And you might want that, for example, if you're doing one where you're playing with it with Hadoop, and you're doing a different one where maybe you're doing something else, Jupyter Notebooks or something. Something to file away for just in case. You can also run Docker inside of WSL with GPU pass-through, and this is actually, it's technically preview, but it's actually pretty broadly distributed preview. And so you can actually run it and see Docker as a containerization platform using the Windows containers to run inside of the environment. And it's a bit more of it's a better performance experience than some of the alternatives. And with that, I've reached the end of pretty much what I have to say. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Let me know if this is useful or not. It's something to kind of keep in the back of your mind, especially as a data scientist. You may find that having a Linux machine is desirable. And so in that situation, you probably may want to take a look at something like WSL, because you don't have to do a lot of the hard stuff you have to do otherwise. And that's the motivation, is it makes it easier to run Linux, which may also make it easier for you to do some of the analysis you want to do. A lot of things are cross-platform, but there's still some things that aren't. So it's just something to consider. And with that, I'll wrap it up. If you have any questions, let me know. That's what I'm here for. Stay safe, and we will talk again next week.